There are moments in history that don't arrive with warning. They don't knock. They don't wait. They simply detonate. And when the smoke finally clears, the world is never quite the same again. This is one of those moments. A story that begins in the candlelit silence of a Budapest church, winds through the corridors of power in Washington, and explodes in the heart of the most dangerous gathering the modern world has ever seen. It is a story about a woman who shattered every ceiling ever built above her, and then found herself fighting not just for her country, but for her own survival, and for the lives of the people she loved most. She moved like someone who had learned, long ago, that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The exchange was supposed to be clean. A church in Budapest, a buyer, a crypto transfer, $70 million in Bitcoin changing hands before anyone had time to think twice. But the moment he asked her to wait, to let him verify the blockchain first, she felt it. That cold, electric shift in the air that every survivor eventually learns to recognize.
She didn't hesitate.
The vigil candle connected with the side of his head before the sentence left his lips, and she was already running before his body hit the stone floor. His men poured out of the shadows behind her, and the ancient city became a maze she had to think faster than. She dove through a tattoo shop, shattered a window, launched herself off a table, and used a street umbrella like a weapon, sending one pursuer crashing to the pavement below. She slipped into a bar, stripped off her jacket, and tried to disappear into the noise and the neon. But disappearing was no longer an option. A man named Rutledge had already found her. He sat down at the bar like any other stranger, ordered a beer like any other man, and waited for the moment her guard dropped by a fraction of an inch. That was all he needed. The injection was fast. The darkness came faster. When she collapsed, she had no way of knowing that the wallet stolen from her unconscious body was about to set the entire world on fire. 70 million in Bitcoin, now in the hands of a man with a plan so ambitious and so terrifying, it could bring the global financial system to its knees. Half a world away, in the quiet hours before dawn, a different woman was being woken up, not by an enemy, but by the kind of crisis only a mother truly understands. President Danielle Sutton had carried more weight than most people could imagine. A war veteran, a mother of two, the first Black woman ever to sit in the Oval Office. She had climbed every impossible mountain, broken every impossible rule, and still found a way to smile through the cameras with something genuine behind her eyes. But tonight, the call wasn't about foreign policy or national security. It was about her 17-year-old daughter, Serena, who had slipped out of the White House, hacked her way past the RFID security system with a homemade key card, and ended up dancing in a Georgetown bar while the late-night news cameras rolled outside. Sutton stood in the hallway of the most powerful residence on Earth, looking at her teenage daughter with a feeling that no title, no motorcade, no security detail could ever fix the helpless, furious love of a mother who had given everything and still couldn't protect her child from herself. The argument was sharp and fast, and left wounds that didn't bleed. Serena insisted it was nothing, that she was just a teenager wanting one normal night. Her father Derek tried to play the voice of reason. Her brother Demetrius had known and said nothing, and that silence cut deeper than anyone admitted. The first gentleman sent them all to bed with the weary authority of a man who had learned to be the calm eye of every storm. But nothing was calm. It never really was. Because somewhere in the world, a clock had already started ticking, and Danielle Sutton didn't know yet just how little time she had left. Morning brought her back to her rituals. Before the briefings, before the press, before the weight of the nation settled onto her shoulders again, there was the training room, and there was Agent Manny Ruiz. He had protected her for years, a man whose loyalty ran deeper than any chain of command could measure. Their sparring sessions were one of the few places where she wasn't a president, just a fighter, breathing hard, pushing back, and occasionally throwing her most trusted bodyguard straight onto the mat with a move clean enough to make him laugh as he hit the ground. It was the last uncomplicated joy she would feel for a very long time. By the time she stood before the cameras that afternoon and announced the Together plan, her initiative to deliver digital microloans to sub-Saharan farmers who had never once held a bank account in their lives, the world was already watching with unequal eyes. Some with hope, some with contempt. One reporter, with a smile that looked like a blade, asked how she expected to protect an entire nation if she couldn't even control her own daughter. She ended the press conference without answering. Some questions don't deserve the dignity of a response. The G20 summit in Cape Town was supposed to be her moment, the stage where her vision for a new global economy would finally come to life. Instead, it became a trap. The Grand Diamond Hotel gleamed with the borrowed light of 40 world leaders and their entourages, all pressed into formal attire and polished smiles. She wore the red gown, the one the stylist had insisted on, the one she'd hesitated over. The British Prime Minister, Oliver Everett, admired it and dismissed everything beneath it in the same breath. Elena Romano, the formidable new head of the IMF, moved through the room like a force of nature dressed in silk. And somewhere in the back corridors of that beautiful, doomed hotel, men were working in silence, reprogramming the ballroom doors, smuggling weapons inside camera cases, poisoning the air filtration systems, cutting the cell towers, and the Wi-Fi dead. They had been there for days. They knew every protocol, every emergency exit, every name on the presidential detail. This was not a robbery. This was a surgical demolition. The explosion arrived without mercy. A bomb, buried in the honeymoon suite, detonated with a force that erased the entire U.S. Special Forces counter-assault team in a single, thunderous instant. The doors locked. The gas reached the guards before they could reach their radios. Inside the ballroom, leaders who had been sipping champagne moments before were now choking in the dark, watching their security teams collapse around them. When what appeared to be a rescue team finally pushed through the doors, hope surged through the room and died just as quickly when one of the leaders tried to walk toward them and was shot in the head before he took a second step. The world's most powerful people had just become hostages. And the man holding them was not after money, or territory, or political concessions. He was after something far older and far more dangerous. He was after justice, or at least his tortured version of it. Sutton moved through the chaos like someone who had trained her whole life not to be paralyzed by it. Manny pulled her low. Joanna Worth was grabbed before anyone could reach her. The Prime Minister stumbled in confusion. And then Sutton did something that nearly got her killed. She turned back into the fire instead of away from it, racing toward Everett as the attackers tightened their grip around the room. Manny was faster. He put the threat down before it could breathe. They found a hidden door behind the bar. Sutton grabbed a fire extinguisher. Manny shot it open, and a wall of white smoke billowed outward like a curtain being yanked across a stage. She ran. The group ran with her. Elena Romano, Han Min-seo, the South Korean First Lady, a handful of shaken survivors who had chosen a woman they barely knew over the walls closing in behind them. Up on the roof, Serena Sutton was having a different kind of crisis. Derek and Demetrius had managed to overpower one of Ruddle's men in the kids' room, buying just enough time to barricade the door and hatch a plan. They slipped out to the adjacent balcony, tied bedsheets to the railing like a decoy, and disappeared into the next room before the pursuers came crashing in. Demetrius, sharp and steady in spite of everything, had started to notice something wrong about the men guarding them, not just their weapons, but their faces. One of those faces belonged to Agent Darden, a name from their own detail, a man who was supposed to die before he let them be touched. Derek saw it too. He said nothing.
Not yet.
Because out on that rooftop, Serena Sutton was already doing what she did best, taking apart a satellite dish and building something no one had asked her to build. Remote uplink powerful enough to reach the Pentagon. She hit send 1 second before Darden found them. They hung from the outside ledge of the building in the dark, in the wind, listening to him search the room above them, and said nothing. Her message landed in Washington like a lifeline thrown across an ocean. The vice president finally knew two things. The president was alive, and a traitor was inside the wire. Back on the ground, Rutledge had seized the airwaves. His face filled screens from Tokyo to Toronto, a man who spoke with the cold certainty of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for years. He called the world's governments thieves. He called the G20 a heist dressed in diplomatic clothing. He urged the public to abandon their banks, flood their savings into cryptocurrency, and watch the old world burn. And then, quietly and methodically, he began to record it. One by one, he forced the captured world leaders to read a sentence. A pangram. Every letter of the alphabet, woven into a single phrase, just enough for voice cloning software to reconstruct anything he wanted them to say. The South Korean president recognized it immediately. He refused. Rutledge reached for a blade. The ear came off before the scream finished forming. The others read their sentences. Slowly, carefully, exactly as they'd been told. The deep fakes dropped online like grenades without pins. The German chancellor appeared to announce a global surveillance currency. The French prime minister seemed to celebrate his own corruption with a smile. Markets hemorrhaged. Cryptocurrency skyrocketed. The panic he manufactured was turning into the fortune he'd engineered. Every second of fear was being converted into profit, straight into the wallet he had stolen in Budapest, now bulging with wealth built entirely on the terror of innocent people. And as the world watched in horror, as the intelligence agencies went blind and the military task force debated every move for fear of triggering an execution, a woman in a red gown was fighting her way through the basement of that hotel with a handgun, a bodyguard, and the kind of fury that only comes from having survived everything life has already thrown at you. They moved through the laundry room, over the elevator shaft, through the ceiling, and into the walls of the building like ghosts were learning how to be human. Everett hit his hand against the elevator shaft and cried out, and for one terrible second, the mercenaries below went still. Sutton dropped. The attack came before she hit the floor. She was losing. Hands around her throat, the room beginning to narrow and darken, and then Elena Romano, still clinging to the top of the elevator, tore a strip from the presidential gown, looped it around the man's neck, and pulled. He dropped. Sutton got back up, breathing hard, and with 2 shots, ended the rest of it. Everyone looked at her differently after that. Not with less respect, with more. The moment that stopped everything came in the underground garage, crouched beside the armored presidential vehicle they'd fought through half the hotel to reach. Rutledge's voice came through on the radio, and it carried the one thing that could make her stop. He had Derek. He had surveillance footage of the kids. He gave her a choice that wasn't a choice at all: surrender herself, or watch her family disappear from the face of the earth one by one. She heard her husband's voice break through the static for one brief second, enough for him to say the name Darden before the signal was cut, and something struck him hard. She heard the impact. She held the radio against her chest for a moment, and then she lifted her chin, told the others to take the vehicle, and walked back into the fire alone. But she didn't go alone for long. Manny heard the door of the beast close without her weight behind it, and he threw it back open and hit the pavement at a dead run. The world leaders she had spent the night protecting turned a bulletproof limousine around and drove it straight into enemy fire to come back for her. Elena Romano gripped the wheel. Prime Minister Everett sat beside her like a man who had just rediscovered what courage felt like. The car absorbed missile fire, absorbed gunfire, absorbed everything, and crashed through the gate and into the open air with the kind of defiant noise that only history makes when it finally breaks in the right direction. It was Serena who cracked the last lock. 17 years old, dangling from a rooftop ledge in Cape Town, still carrying the key card reader she had originally built to sneak out to a party. She wired it into the hotel's RFID grid from the surveillance room and began dismantling Rutledge's fortress from the inside, door by door, camera by camera, floor by floor. She watched her mother fight hand-to-hand in a hallway with no ammunition left, and guided a Navy SEAL team through corridors they had never seen toward a private conference room where the man responsible for all of it was now alone with 3 hostages and a recording device, demanding that the President of the United States read a sentence that would let him destroy the American economy by morning. She read it. She had no choice. And Rutledge smiled the way men smile when they believe they've already won. Then he told her why. He had been in Fallujah, front of the caravan, clearing bombs from the road, when an American-made explosive killed 2 of his brothers and left the rest of them bleeding in the dust. And while he grieved in the dark, a photograph of Danielle Sutton holding a child in the rubble had made her a hero across every front page in the world. He called her a fraud. He called the photo a lie. And there was just enough truth buried inside his rage to make the accusation land like a fist. She told him he would never leave this building alive. Furious, he raised the gun and shot Derek. Sutton launched herself across the room at him, without hesitation. They fell. They fought. The crypto wallet hit the floor, and Joanna Worth moved faster than anyone expected, sliding it into her pocket with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. None of them saw it. They were all watching the brawl. None of them saw it. Until, just as Rutledge raised the gun again, Han Mincio stepped forward from the shadows and buried a knife in his back.
He fell.
Sutton scrambled to Derek, pulled back his shirt, and found the bulletproof vest beneath it. She closed her eyes for 1 second and allowed herself one breath of pure relief. Then she turned around and saw Joanna's hand moving. The wallet was already gone. Sutton had trusted her, served beside her, fought a war with her in a single night. She looked at Joanna for a long moment, and then she hit her, clean, hard, and without hesitation. She took back the wallet and turned around and found that Rutledge was gone. Demetrius appeared in the doorway, breathless.
His face said everything.
Rooftop. Serena.
Now. She ran.
Up through stairwells, up through smoke and debris, up until she burst through the roof door and found him strapping Serena into the helicopter with the mechanical calm of a man who had already calculated every exit. She held the crypto wallet up between them in the thin morning air and offered him a trade, simple, clean, and completely dishonest. She walked toward him slowly, and at exactly the right moment, she threw the wallet high into the open sky. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He lunged.
He missed.
The wallet tumbled over the edge of the roof and was swallowed by the city below. He turned back to her with $70 billion worth of rage and opened fire. The helicopter tilted. The world tilted. Sutton got her hands on his weapon, and with every piece of strength she had left, she threw him off the edge of the roof. He fell without a sound. And then the helicopter began to slide, dragging the 2 of them toward the edge after him. Serena grabbed her mother's arm. She pulled. The Navy SEALs hit the roof and seized the rope. 13 men hauled together with everything they had, and the helicopter stopped moving, hanging suspended above the city like a held breath. And then it was still. In the quiet that followed, the world began to exhale. Joanna Worth was escorted away in handcuffs, her career and her freedom both finished before the cameras even arrived. The hostages were freed. The deep fakes were flagged and dismantled one by one. The markets were volatile for weeks, but they stabilized, the way things tend to, once the fear runs out of places to go. In the final frame, the Sutton family stood together in front of a red gown hanging behind glass, torn at the hem, marked by everything that had happened, still beautiful in a way that only things that have survived something terrible can be. Serena stood closest to it. She had earned that. Some people become legends by standing above the fight. Danielle Sutton became one by throwing herself straight into the middle of it, not because the cameras were watching, not because the history books were waiting, but because the people she loved were still inside that building. And she had never once, in her entire life, left anyone behind.